Thank you very much, Jean. Just I'm hearing a lot of noise in the background, so if you all can mute yourself until we have some questions, that would be great. Very appreciated, so everybody can hear us as well as possible. So, as Jean was saying, I'm currently working for UNDP, and we're redesigning the payment for ecosystem services scheme of Costa Rica, which is my home country, and I'm also helping designing a marine payment for ecosystem services for the World Bank, also in Costa Rica, together with the team. So this is part of what I wanted to present today, and I first want to thank CFA for the opportunity, for being willing to these kind of events of science communications. I really appreciate it a lot, and I hope everybody can learn something from today's presentation. So this presentation is focused on the marine realm for coastal and marine ecosystems, but everything that I'm going to say apply also for terrestrial ecosystems. So the idea is here to present the whole methodology illustrated in the marine realm, but you can apply it in any kind of ecosystem. So just please bear that in mind. Let me take control of the screen. So first, let me make this smaller. So first, as an introduction, well, Costa Rica it's more than a green country. It is a blue one. We actually have more area from the ocean and coastal ecosystems than terrestrial area. We have a variety of coastal and marine ecosystems, such as mangroves, coral reefs, seagrasses, salt marshes, etc., and of course the open ocean and more in-depth ocean ecosystems. So right now, as I was saying, Costa Rica has more marine area protected than actually forest area, which is incredible. As in many parts of the world currently, degradation in these ecosystems it's happening in different rates. Some parts highly accelerated, and some of the causes of this is because many of these ecosystems and their services are public goods, so their management sometimes is not very clear or presents specific challenges that we're going to talk about in a minute. And not everything it's the fault of the market, but in this case, market failed to incorporate the value of these ecosystems and the benefits that they produce, and simply institutions are simply doesn't exist. Those institutions that can internalize this value. So one straightforward solution would be creating financial incentives and financial mechanisms and new institutions. But this is just one solution. It's not that payment for ecosystem services or market-based mechanisms or financial mechanisms is like the only or best solution. It has to be developed together with other sustainability solutions and environmental and social solutions. As I'm always saying, there might not be even environmental solutions. What there are is social and economic solutions. If you go to the root causes of environmental problems, the big majority are economic or social. So PS schemes are widely known for more than 2 decades right now, and Costa Rica started his forest scheme in 1996. So we have now more than 20 years of experience in this scheme. But sometimes the definition of what is a PS scheme or payment for ecosystem services scheme is not that clear, and different authors has defined it differently. And this is because you can see, and this is very economic, that I'm not gonna go in depth on this, but mainly two approaches one that what they call cohesion, and one that is called Pigovian. And those more from the economic background would be very familiar with these concepts. So the cohesion ones are limited. There are not many of these, and this is where the government doesn't play a role. So it's very straightforward or very direct between who is selling the service and who is beneficiating or buying that service. For example, water bottling companies that pay upstream farmers for better practices to improve the water quality, right? So it's just a mechanism between those two parties, and it's a direct interchange of them. On the contrary, the Pigovian one is more characterized by the intervention of the government. So, and that's the big majority of schemes that we have right now, as well as the Costa Rican one. So, and this is, I think, the last slide that I'm going to present with theory. Wunder, in more than 15 years ago, defined payment for ecosystem services under 5 features or characteristics or requirement. And the first one is that it has to be a voluntary transaction where a well-defined ecosystem services or land use, for example, is being bought by a minimum of one ecosystem service buyer from a minimum one ecosystem services provider or seller, and only if the ecosystem service provider secures ecosystem service provision. So that's what we call conditionality. So this interchange or this scheme would only be maintained if the seller secures the provision of what it's selling, in this case, the ecosystem service for the beneficiary. The Pigovian approach, many authors has also defined, and one definition that I like is from Moradian. It's where you have a transfer of resources between social actors, so it's broader here as the one that I just mentioned before, which aims to create incentives to align individual and or collective land use decisions with the social interest in the management of natural resources. So here, there's more space for different kind of schemes, and not only that direct transaction between two parties. Jim Salzman, I don't know if you've heard of this paper. It came almost 2 years ago, and it's a very good one. It was on nature sustainability. It would be worth checking out. Found that currently there's 555 active PA schemes around the world, and the whole combined payment that they're managing right now, it's almost 40 billion. Which is impressive how this financial mechanism has increasing popularity within policymakers throughout the world. 70% of these are focused on watershed, mainly water funds. So these are sort of like the low-hanging fruit sometimes for ecosystem services, because it's where the buyer and the beneficiary it's better or more or clearer defined. There is some 21% that is focused on biodiversity and habitats, and the rest, about 9% on forest and land use carbon programs. Of course, there are many payment for ecosystem services that take into account all of these under only one scheme. So there you can combine different approaches or ecosystem services and activities under one scheme. Nevertheless, right now there aren't many, or at least as this study found, or at least as the study was focused on, none for coastal and marine ecosystems. And this presents, of course, an opportunity for the creation of new financial mechanisms in this realm. And that's why because of that reason, I'm proposing to develop in Costa Rica the Blue Fund, which can be developed in any part of the world, of course. And the Blue Fund would be the brother or the sister of the current Forest Fund, for example. So the Blue Fund would be a new scheme, like I was saying, focused on coastal and marine ecosystems. And the main goal, as it is in other schemes, would be to change the behavior of any actor that has or could have a negative impact on any of these ecosystems. But also, on the other side, to reward those actors, those stakeholders that have a positive impact on these ecosystems. And there are many examples on how people are protecting or restoring or enhancing these ecosystems that they could have a financial incentive to do a better job or to continue doing their conservation or restoration job right now. Mainly, if you're going to design a payment for ecosystem services scheme, you have to take in consideration three key elements, which I've already talked a little bit about this. One is the seller. So the seller is who's providing the service. Also the buyer, and the buyer is who's getting beneficiating from this service, or the beneficiaries, right? And the financial mechanisms that are going to play to make all the interactions between these two parties. And I'm going to put again the example of Costa Rica. And the current payment for ecosystem services, that it's called payment for environmental service, or PSA in Spanish. We have a buyer, which is the government, and that's the Pigovian approach that I was telling you before, where the government intervenes to collect the benefits from those sellers. And then we have many sellers, which are the private landowners, those that have some forest in their properties or that owns a big portion of forest. Those are the ones that are selling the ecosystem services. And in the case of Costa Rica, the scheme is based on 4 ecosystem services, and this was set in the forest law, which is water provision, scenic beauty, biodiversity, and carbon sequestration. So those 4 are the ones that the current scheme is based on. On the other side, if we want to work or design a new scheme for the marine ecosystem services, we have all the contrary of what we have on forest, because instead of having one buyer, we would have several or many buyers, several sectors that get benefits from ecosystem services. And we would have a monopoly, if you want to call it that way, because it would be only the government who would be selling those services. And this is because, at least in Costa Rica, the government owns, it's the owner of marine and coastal ecosystems such as mangroves or coral reefs, etc. So how do we design these schemes? And I took that picture in the Caribbean of Costa Rica, and I really like it because here you have the interaction between forest, and not all are mangroves, and the marine realm, especially the coral reefs, which is going to be a key issue that I'm going to address further along. And it's that interaction between ecosystems that the majority of times is not that clear, or you shouldn't separate it. And I'm going to go step by step of this sort of a recipe that I designed. And I'm going to illustrate it through mangroves and coral reefs, so you have a better idea on how this works. So the Blue Fund, as I was saying, part of the objective would be, or the whole objective, the main objective, the goal would be investing in public and private funds in marine and coastal ecosystem services, conservation, restoration, enhancement for the well-being of people who depend on them, right? At the end, if we're talking about ecosystem services, which as defined by, for example, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, are the benefits that we get from healthy ecosystems, we're also talking about the well-being of people, and that's a key issue that we want to address also with these schemes. And this agenda or recipe, which has some policy and some research components, consists of 6 steps, and I'm going to go through each one of them as I was saying. Here, I'm going to present all of them, and then we're going to go on explaining each one of them. So the first thing, or where you start, is with an ecosystem assessment. That would be first step, or choosing which ecosystem you're going to focus on your scheme. Then selecting those ecosystem services and also valuing them. Valuation, as I'm going to say in a bit, is not a it shouldn't be a requirement specifically, but it helps very much in different stages. So I highly recommend it. Then conducting a threat identification and then a prioritization of which are the main threats of the ecosystems that we selected. Then designing all the institutional arrangement and the financial mechanisms, who or what kind of institution or organization is going to manage the whole scheme, both from a technical point of view, but also from a financial point of view. And then, of course, the implementation of the activities that we're going to finance through the scheme. And these activities are going to go through conservation, restoration, or enhancement of the ecosystem. And one key last one is the monitoring and evaluation, but also to be able to adapt this scheme. So there's always a space for improvement. So the first step, the ecosystem assessment. You select the ecosystems that are going to be subject to the PS scheme. In the case of Costa Rica, of course, it's just one ecosystem, which is forest, the current terrestrial one, and but you can expand it to coral reefs or mangroves, as I'm proposing here. Also, you have to have a good idea of the location of these ecosystems, the extension, and hopefully the health, because the health has a key role, or plays a key role in the provision of services. You can have a very extensive forest, but if it has a very low health, might not be providing the ecosystem services that you would associate with a big area of forest or any other kind of ecosystem. And this is also key for the last activity that I was mentioning of monitoring and evaluation, because with these biophysical characteristics, you would be able to establish the baseline of the ecosystem cover and status. And this is key because one principle that I already mentioned was conditionality, right? The scheme is maintained while the seller is provisioning the service. But also another one, which is key, is additionality. So that conservation or restoration of the ecosystem has to be additional of what would happen if the payment for ecosystem services wouldn't have been in place. So that's key, and in some schemes this is not very clearly defined. And just to put as an example of mangroves, know that we have around 36 hectares of mangroves. Unfortunately, more than half we have lost almost half of the original cover, and the big majority are in the Pacific. So here it gives you an idea where to put in place the scheme. And also we have a pretty good idea of what species of the ecosystem of mangroves we have in the country. And having a map of mangroves, it's certainly a bit easy, especially today with so many GIS tools and resources. So that's the map of mangroves in Costa Rica. So we can prioritize where should we put in place our payment for ecosystem services, depend on where the ecosystem is healthier or where it has more extensive cover, and also where are the beneficiaries. That it's one step that I'm going to talk in as well. In coral reefs, that was again a picture that I took in the Caribbean, in the South Caribbean of Costa Rica, where you can see very clear the coral reefs extension of that specific part. We know that we have the cover area, we have how this ecosystem is distributed across the both coasts, especially in the Pacific as well, and where are the most extensive coral reefs in the country. So again, we would have a pretty good idea where to target. This is important, targeting, where to target the payments, and in this case, which would be the key locations that require right now conservation or restoration measures or activities. This is a very simple map where I did a little bit bigger the blue areas just to make it better visually. Those is where we have our main coral reefs extensions, and I'm missing here a big island that we have, the Cocos Island, which also it's key for these ecosystems. Then, based on what we already identified, we should identify, okay, which benefits these ecosystems is providing to the national or regional or even the global population. So a core part of the scheme which are the ecosystem services that are going to be sold, right? We're seeing this from the seller or supplier perspective, and almost all ecosystem services of mangroves and coral reefs in this case are public goods or common pool resources, and this presents quite new challenges on how do you manage them. There are a few ones, for example, fiber or timber that are within the market, but at least in Costa Rica, these products of these ecosystems are illegal. You cannot take timber from a mangrove or other activities or extractive activities. So you can say that all the ecosystem services from these ecosystems are public goods or common pool resources. And I'm not gonna stop here because the majority of you might already see this classification of the different categories of ecosystem services, and this is according to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Sorry, there's Manuel Quiroz. Can you mute yourself, please? So there's some other classifications where supporting services are within regulating services, but that's a very academic discussion that, of course, we're not going to have here, but it's important. In case of these two ecosystems, you can have, or you can select many of these ecosystem services, but for the sake of the example, we can focus on these three for each one of them. For coral reefs, you could have tourism, recreation, which is one of the biggest ones, and coastal protection from storms, sea level rise, etc., and also biodiversity. As we all know, although coral reefs represent only 1% of the total area in the ocean, it hosts about a quarter of biodiversity. So as a habitat, as a nursery also for commercial fisheries, it's key. And I had given some codes because at the end I put everything together, so you remember it's easy to remember how you associate the ecosystem services with different components. Examples of buyers, of course, of tourism and recreation are the tourists, for example, those that do snorkeling or diving, and coastal protection, private and the public sector, all the assets, infrastructure that is in front of the beach that gets protected by these ecosystems it's key. Then for biodiversity, you have society as a whole, those the people that might not have a direct benefit from these ecosystems, but that they value it, and so they are an important beneficiary. And here you could also have all that cultural part, and that is not within the market, but also those cultural variables, those communities that have a cultural attachment to these ecosystems and fisheries, as I was mentioning. And for mangroves, one that is very clear is the blue carbon that this ecosystem hosts or sequesters, and coastal protection as well, and food. We did a study where a couple of colleagues, Robert Costanza, Miguel Cifuentes, and myself did for Conservation International in Costa Rica. We valued these three ecosystem services, so in case anybody's interested in seeing that study, I'll be happy to share with them. And for blue carbon, you have governments, both national but also international, those especially that wants to comply with their carbon targets, although now it's a fuzzy area under the Paris Agreement, but also businesses that have their voluntarily markets, carbon markets, for example. Coastal protection, again, private and public sector. In Costa Rica, for example, hotels, big hotels with very important assets are protected by these ecosystems. And food, as for fisheries, it's quite important. In one part of the country, the Gulf of Nicoya, which is actually where 95% of the fisheries comes from, mangroves play a key role in protecting these assets or these assets for fisheries as a nursery grounds for them. So the economic valuation could be conducted for several reasons of the ecosystem services. One is to allow policymakers and potential buyers that are within the scheme to have a better idea of the cost benefit of what they're investing in, right? So for each dollar, how much I'm getting back in this income, or environmental social income, as we can call it. It could be for one or many beneficiaries for every dollar that you invest in it. There's some studies, for example, that says for every dollar that it has been invested in protected areas, in ecosystem services, it has been like 100 or even more, a rate of 100 or more in return. So this is why I was telling the importance of conducting this economic valuation. Also helping generate demand for the service, as well as the scheme that we develop, and we're going to see this in a bit, can be funded through different sources, And one of these sources could be charging polluters under the polluters pay principle. So you know, you have to know how much to charge, and many times that that fee that you're going to charge is based on the value of the ecosystem that was degraded or destroyed. And I'm gonna go real quick through this. This is how much are the ecosystem services that I presented, how much they are valued, and this is in terms of per hectare per year for 27 price level. So it's a bit old, but that's for coral reefs. In the more recent study that we did in Costa Rica, we valued each hectare of ecosystem services in those values. So regarding threats, then the third step, you do a threat identification and prioritization. And here you can see, for example, that's a sedimentation plume, which is one of the main threats for these ecosystems, especially for coral reefs. And this is because the extension and, of course, the health of the ecosystem that we had determined in the first step is a product of the existence or absence of these threats, right? And it's also crucial to identify these drivers of change in order to invest in solutions that are the most needed, right? So the solutions and activities that you're going to invest in have to be in relation with the main threats. Otherwise, you're making your scheme less effective and efficient, of course. So I had done a review of which would be the main threats in Costa Rica for these two ecosystems. So that's a big list. And the idea is, once you have the list of threats, you can prioritize which ones you think are the most important ones, or the ones that have the biggest impact. And of course, this can be done through different ways, such as workshops or focus groups, etc. If you make it as participatory as possible, then you would have better results. So I try to identify which threats are common in these two ecosystems, and I found, for example, unsustainable agricultural activities, it's one of the main ones. Climate change and climate variability, and plastic waste. So those three, could be others, but again, for the sake of this illustration of each one of the steps, let's focus on those three. And so the following steps will address these specific threats, as you'll see. The next step, then, once you have all the ecosystem services, and which threats are having an impact on the ecosystem that you selected, then comes sort of the core, or one of the core steps of the scheme, which is the creation of the funding sources and the investment. And here the goal is to incorporate the positive externalities, like we did through valuation and identification of the ecosystem services, but also to be able to incorporate the negative externalities. So how we're going to incorporate those threats and negative impacts from certain economic activities into the payment for ecosystem services scheme. And as I said before, one of the major ones, it's agriculture, which is, in Costa Rica we highly depend on. And so having a clear picture of who are the polluters and also who are the buyers is key to create the most appropriate financial incentive that, of course, would produce the change in behavior, which is the goal here, towards better management of these ecosystems. So following that example, we can say that, well, if we're gonna have coral reefs, we're gonna have mangroves, on one side, we're gonna have the polluters. And as we already said, since, for example, climate change is one of the main threats. Polluters are also related to those threats. High carbon intensive activities is one of the main threats for both of them. And plastic waste also has an impact on those ecosystems. And finally, agriculture, which is actually one of the main ones. On the other side, you have buyers, and the buyers is who benefits from these services. And as I was saying before, you have tourists, some business, fisheries, and even governments. Sorry, I have here on my way. So coral reefs have provide services to all of these three, and mangroves also to all of these three. I didn't put a direct relationship between mangroves and tourists just because right now tourism in mangroves is not highly developed in Costa Rica, but of course that would be an economic opportunity to develop, especially you know, how many fauna species of animals you can see, both aquatic but also special birds. So we could even have an industry right now that instead of doing bird watching with hiking boots, you would be doing bird watching in a kayak through mangroves, which I think would be pretty cool and amazing. So the polluters and buyers will be the source of the funding. This is where we're gonna get the money, and that's how we're gonna feed the blue fund in this case. And there would be the source of funding of the government, because like we said, this case it would be a monopoly. It would be the only seller, and they will receive these funds in order to be able to invest in the activities that address the main threats that we already said before. The government should design, of course, a very innovative institutional framework. For example, right now in Costa Rica for forests, we have the Forest Fund, which is called FONAFIFO in Spanish. And this institution has the task of managing these financial resources, as well as to monitor the success of the investment in order to comply with the conditionality and additionality principles. Creating a single institution like the Blue Fund might not be the only option. For example, again, in the case of our country, institutions could include, or other options could include expanding the current ones, for example, expanding the current Forest one into a broader institution that I call the Natural Capital Fund, where you could have different ecosystems, both terrestrial and marine ones. As well, as it would be very important to have both public and private ecosystems, or privately or publicly owned ecosystems. And finally, on this step, this fund, the Blue Fund, would receive economic sources from the activities that are degrading these ecosystems, such as the polluters that we already saw, as well from the activities that depend on their ecosystem services. And that would be the case of the beneficiaries. So if we focused on the Blue Fund on coral reefs and mangroves, in one side, you could have the sources which would be mandatory to pay under the polluters pay principle, for example. And these are not the only ones that we can have. It's just, again, a matter for the illustration. We could have a plastic tax, which I think a year and a half we did a study here, and we determined that every year, if we tax specific products, not all products, but specific products, we can have an income for the fund of around $25 million a year. And if we have another type of tax, a carbon tax, as the one that we already have actually for fossil fuels, uh, for, for every for every liter of fossil fuel that you consume in Costa Rica, from the gains of that liter, 3.5% of that goes to the forest fund. And that means, or it has become actually the main source of funding for FONAFIFO, which is 96% of their income. So imagine how important only one source can become. But also on the other side, how vulnerable it can be, right? Especially in Costa Rica, for example, we have now the decarbonization plan. So what happened if we decarbonize our economy and we're going to have less consumption of fossil fuels? Of course, that tax is going to be reduced, and then the income for the forest fund would be reduced. And on the other side, you could have other sources that could be voluntary. As an example, diving fee. I don't know how many of you like to dive, but I love to dive. In Costa Rica, I only pay to the diving shop. So I'm using the Costa Rican natural capital, in this case, the coral reefs, for free. And if I do something wrong in this ecosystem, nobody is going to charge me anything right now. So this could be an important source. And many studies that I can also give you the list have proven that divers are willing to pay a certain amount, a certain fee for their diving activities. So it's already proven that this is very feasible. And then carbon credits, blue carbon credits, which has not been developed so far, and which would be very innovative. Moving to almost the last step 5, implementation of the forest, the conservation and restoration projects. Here, you would have to develop or to design the different projects that are going to be funded through the funds that we already said that we're going to collect in the previous steps. And this has to be strictly related to the main threats that we had identified first. And here, projects can be developed by different actors, for example, NGOs, local communities, business. So if you also develop these kind of projects hand in hand with local communities, you would also have a positive impact on livelihoods. And in case of countries like ours, developing countries, you would also have a positive impact on poverty reduction, which is not exactly one of the main targets of PS scheme, but it has become like a more regular objective of these kind of schemes. And these organizations or these associations of people would be what I call the implementers, and they are going to be the one who would receive the payment to conduct these management activities. And could be very highly criticized, but I put a picture of coral gardening, and this is just to illustrate activities that can restore the ecosystem. We could have mangrove restoration, which is very important, especially if you have all the technical knowledge to do it correctly. So these kind of activities can play a key role. And well, payments would be main in 2 moments of the framework. From the private buyers, like we were saying, the diving fee or the carbon credits. And this is where we call that the ecosystem services are sold under a stacking or layering approach. So you are sort of buying specific ecosystem services. And if you're paying a diving fee, you're paying for the ecosystem service of recreation, right? Of carbon credits, you're paying for the specific service of carbon sequestration. But if you pay at the other moment of the scheme, which is paying to the implementers of the activities, at the end what you're paying is a service under a bundling in which payments are made for multiple ecosystems. So if I'm doing mangrove restoration, I'm paying for an activity that is going to have a positive impact on several ecosystem services. So that's very important. So this is just a summary of the different threats, the different solutions, who would be the implementers, and how payments could be made. And it's also important because some kind of payments could be in cash or could be in kind. For example, in some communities for mangrove restoration, they would pay to the community in developing new schools or providing books for that school or providing boats for fisheries, etc., etc. So that's a key component of it. And last step, it's like I said in the beginning, is the evaluation and adaptation of the scheme. And so we have to assess regularly the additionality of the project that we invested in, as well as to be able to keep monitoring the scheme to comply with the conditionality principle that I had mentioned before. And also it's important to develop standardized indicators for each one of these. And it could be that we can incorporate new technologies in these last activities. GIS is a key one, and now with all the development of new technologies such as drones and drone mapping. And I'll give you an example of one that I was doing in the Caribbean. That's a satellite image that you can use, to monitor the extension of the ecosystem or some of the threats to see, for example, sedimentation. But of course, the quality is not very good. And if you want to have very highly quality images, they are very expensive. But using drones, for example, you can go from here to here. So that lets you have a much better monitoring activities in a very efficient way, where you don't have to have someone that has to go, in a boat, or if it is a forest, like going through the forest and walking for hours to monitor like a large patch of forest. You can do it using these very cheap technologies, which are getting cheaper and cheaper. Some final thoughts, because I know we are almost in the hour now. The blue fund is proposed here as a new fund, but as I was saying, could represent a sub fund or a part of what I call the natural capital fund, and where we would have different forests. And also, it's very important that we can recognize the linkages between ecosystems. And for example, for coral reefs, we said that one of the main threats is sedimentation, and sedimentation comes basically from not very good management activities of forest. So here you have the link between forest and the coastal ecosystems such as coral reefs. This is where you cannot separate the blue economy and the green economy. At the end, it's just economy. So you have to target both, and this is also challenging, because if you are gonna develop new measures or new projects for forest management, so that would be right now under the forest fund, but you're doing it because you want to improve the health of the coral reefs, so that would be part of the blue fund. So I think that's part of the discussion that we have to have around the institutional arrangement, which is highly important here. Well, that's from me. I don't know if you can see my email. If you have any questions, comments, please drop me a line. I would be more than happy to continue the conversation. I took that picture in the biggest extension of mangrove, which is, I think, actually the biggest patch in Central America, in the south of Costa Rica, where these ladies, these women, collect mollusks from the forest, and it is part of, or it is an important part of their livelihoods and their income. So here I just wanted to illustrate or to show the face of those beneficiaries that sometimes are hidden, and that's part of why we do this kind of projects and work. Well, thank you very much to everybody, and thanks for being here for a whole hour. And I'm really happy with the attendance. It's so I don't know if we have time for some questions, Nin.
Yeah, hi, Marcel, this is Ray Victorine from WCS and CFA. Sorry I was late, had something come up, but thank you very much for the presentation. And I know there are already a couple of questions that have come up, and Alex had a question, and so I'll read those, and you have a chance to answer. Then if other people have questions, they can put them in the chat box or ask them. I know we don't have a lot of time in terms of the hour, but so there was a question about, as well, Alex wrote, as well as wanting to decarbonize, would you not also wish to deplastic the economy? So reducing, so therefore reducing income from the plastic tax?
Yeah, actually that's key, and it was something that we that I didn't say. But in order to not make the same mistake that we did with, well, it wasn't a mistake, but it wasn't something that we were planning to have this decarbonization and less resources from that source. But in the study that we did on the tax on plastic, we measured how much that resource is going to be decreasing. Hopefully, if we can change the behavior of people and we start eliminating, for example, only one use plastic and those kind of plastic. So we took that in consideration, and that's why you have to have other sources and start also adapting and bringing other financial resources, because hopefully you're going to be successful in these ones.
Okay, thank you. Then another question from Rob came, does the carbon tax apply to the fossil fuel used by divers? So I guess divers and diving industry.
Yeah, the fossil fuel tax right now, I mean, it's for everybody. So if you go diving and you have to buy gasoline for your boat, then you would be paying that tax. And I see where this question is going to. Perhaps it's because if you are paying already for your tax, and then you're paying an additional fee, for example, for diving, it seems that you could be double paying, but you would be paying for different things under different circumstances. But that's also a very key question on how we develop those sources where they don't compete or they don't duplicate efforts.
So basically you're saying you're segregating the ecosystem services, and they're paid separately and not all rolled into one price.
Exactly, because for the carbon tax, it's only focused for carbon sequestration for the forest, and then you would be paying the diving fee, which would be for recreation. But I know if you do a life cycle assessment of the activity of diving, then you could have these kind of issues where you have several financial mechanisms in one place for one activity.
Okay, and then Enrique Paniagua had a question. Would the funds generated by the Blue Fund can be used to finance sustainable, sorry, there are two questions. One is, how do you envision the process by which the government, as only seller, will transfer the funds to NGOs and local communities? That's one. And then would the funds generated by the Blue Fund be used to finance sustainable innovations created by local communities, or only for conservation activities?
Yeah, so regarding the first one, I think it's gonna be hopefully not a very long process, but it's gonna take time because it's just doing almost the opposite of what we've been doing right now, and it's the public paying to the privates. And here we've been with another team, we've been working, as I was saying, for the World Bank to developing those kind of initiatives with of how and how much and to what extent and for what kind of activities we're gonna pay. And for example, we have thought about citizen signs, for example, where the fishermen can identify spawning areas of tuna, which are highly valuable for our fisheries, as well as many other activities. And the funds could be for communities for protection and restoration, but also it could go for innovation. And here also in another project that I used to coordinate, the Blue Challenge, what we wanted is to develop new businesses with blue economy principles that can grow in hand with sustainability. So you could also support those kind of small businesses to grow, to make it more profitable, in order for them to be better prepared to protect the assets.
Well, that kind of flows into the question that Neil had here, which is, are there any financial returns associated with this model? Is there a role for return-seeking investment capital?
Yeah, well, that would depend on the type of mechanisms. I mentioned only a couple of ones that were more directed towards protection and restoration. The return depend on how do you define return, right? You would all, of course, have social returns, but also some restoration. What they could have is avoided cost by businesses. For example, if you get better protection from storms in hotels that we had already identified here in the country, then you would have avoided cost as well. And the returns also would be very clearly defined if you work with small businesses.
Okay, are there any other questions that people have, either written or want to ask directly? Okay, I don't see any others at the moment. So then, well, Marcello, thank you very much for the presentation. Really appreciate it, and all the work you're doing. Good luck with your studies and putting these systems in place.
Well, thank you, and thank you to you and CFA for the invitation and for the space. Thank you for everybody. I think we have a nice attendance, and please contact me if we can collaborate somehow. If you have any further questions or comments, I would be really happy to hear back from you and from you guys at CFA. Please let us keep in touch.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for attending. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Marcelo.
Thank you. Bye.